It's me, Jessica McCaskill, WBC, WBA, Super Lightweight Unified Champion of the world. I wanted to give a big shout out to The Relay on YouTube. Check it out. Great boxing talk show. Has all the info that you need. Check it out. The Relay on YouTube.
Motherfucking Relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Mike Kopinger tweeted, Sergey Derevyanchenko advisor Keith Connolly tells me he hasn't heard from the Canelo side. Sergey is excited by the prospect of fighting Triple G for the vacant title. And if it ends up being another opponent, Sergey will look to unify with Jermall Charlo next year on a PBC platform. And, you know, depending on how the cookie crumbles, this could actually be a golden opportunity for Jermall Charlo, who has found himself in a pinch. Let's be honest, ladies and gents, that most of the talk coming out of the middleweight division in regards to Canelo Alvarez seems to suggest that he's done whatever he was going to do in that weight class. You think about what the conversations have been. Conversations about Callum Smith at 168. Conversations about increased offers to Sergey Kovalev, the WBO champion, at 175. These conversations, I mean, the inference you can make is that Canelo Alvarez means to leave the middleweight division and make a move upstairs. And Canelo is the lineal champion. He's the man to beat at that weight. So if the man to beat at the weight is leaving the weight, that crown is going to have to go to somebody who's willing to act fast and act now. That could be Jermall Charlo. And you know what? He needs that boost. He needs to do something to garner positive attention to himself.
He needs it.
To be completely honest, I like the sound of that. I like the sound of a unification fight between what is the WBC middleweight champion Jermall Charlo and what could be the IBF middleweight champion Sergey Derevyanchenko. I don't mind the proposition of that at all. I think it's great for the weight class. I think that we are entering a transitional phase in the middleweight division because of what else is going on there.
And what's not.
You know, Gennady Golovkin doesn't seem the least bit fucking interested in fighting a guy like Jermall Charlo. Regardless of how you want to explain it, he doesn't seem interested in fighting that fighter.
At all.
He could win his title back from that guy. I think it's a winnable fight for Gennady Golovkin, but better still, what I think doesn't matter. It's what he decides to do that tells the story. And he doesn't appear to be going after Jermall Charlo's newly obtained green belt.
Nope.
Who knows if he's going to decide to fight Sergey Derevyanchenko for what could be the red belt. We don't know. But if Gennady Golovkin decides not to fight against Sergey Derevyanchenko and Derevyanchenko ends up the champion anyway by fighting someone else, I don't mind the idea of Charlo versus Derevyanchenko in a unification fight. I don't mind that idea at all. For Jermall Charlo, who hasn't been looking too hot in his last couple of fights, this would be a chance for redemption, and this would be a chance for him to establish himself as the authority in the middleweight division. If he were to, by some chance, unify 2 world titles, yeah, that would make him the man to beat. In the absence of Canelo Alvarez, who appears to be leaving the weight class, at least that's what the conversation suggests, and you know what? Gennady Golovkin, maybe he stays at the weight. Maybe he doesn't. But if he does, you know,
there's fights.
There are fights there. There are fights there. There are fighters there. A lot of people out there will tell you they think Gennady Golovkin can knock out Jermall Charlo. It's a widely shared opinion that Golovkin, even now at 37 years old, still has what it takes to beat the fucking crap out of that guy. But you know what? It's all for nothing if he doesn't go after him. And if he doesn't go after him, if he doesn't reclaim his WBC title, well, that opens the door for Charlo to assume the crown. If Gennady Golovkin, you know, if by some chance, because Gennady Golovkin and Sergey Derevyanchenko are the 2 highest ranked contenders in the IBF's rank standings.
Both of them.
If Golovkin doesn't comply with an order from the IBF, which is likely to come down very soon, and if he doesn't comply with that order, well, that opens the door for Sergey to become a champion, and that opens the door for Sergey to thereby unify with Jermall Charlo. So if Golovkin decides to sit on his hands, that's what's likely to happen. And you can't blame Charlo for it, and you can't blame Sergey for it. I'm sure that both of those guys would relish the opportunity to have that fight with Golovkin. But if he's not pursuing it,
show must go on.
What the fuck can they do about it? Now, there's a lot of people out there who, given how Jermall Charlo has been looking, they don't have a very high opinion of him, not based on his last 2 performances. They think that the guy's a bit of a hype job. They think he's a bit of a shitty fighter. And the idea of a shitty fighter assuming the crown in the middleweight division, well, they might not be too comfortable with that. But to that, I'll say this. This situation reminds me of that old quote from Edmund Burke.
Who's that?
You might be familiar with it. That the only thing that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And if you juxtapose the ideology in that quote to the sport of boxing, well, the only thing necessary for a shitty fighter to triumph is for a good fighter to do nothing. So if Gennady Golovkin so chooses to not fight these kinds of fighters, to not reclaim the belts that were once his, if he so chooses to not take on these challenges, well, that opens the door for those quote-unquote shitty fighters to assume the crown. I mean, if you're of the opinion that Jermall Charlo's no good, he's a hype job, he's a shitty fighter, then, if nobody does anything about it, if nobody really unseats this guy and stops this guy dead in his tracks, well, they're leaving the door open for him to become the authority in the middleweight division. That's the way the cookie crumbles, ladies and gentlemen. To sum it all up, don't sit here telling me about how shitty a fighter Jermall Charlo is and then turn around and make excuses for Golovkin not to fight him. So long as Golovkin insists on campaigning in the middleweight division, if he's not moving on to bigger and better things and he's gonna stay there, then there really isn't a lot of reason for him to not go in that ring and take back that green belt. And don't try to sell me that it's okay for Golovkin to fight a guy like Jaime Munguia when he's got beatable opponents like Jermall Charlo there. You understand? You think Jermall's a beatable opponent, right? You think he's a shitty fighter. You think Gennady Golovkin can beat him. So why are you making excuses for Gennady not to fight him? What's he get out of fighting a Jaime Munguia? What belt does he win? What does that do for his legacy? Taking on an unproven junior middleweight who's got a lot of stripes to earn in his own weight class. That does absolutely nothing for Gennady Golovkin's resume. If you're of the opinion that Jermall Charlo is no good, he's a hype job, and he's a shitty fighter, then don't give me reasons for Golovkin not to fight him. If you think Golovkin can beat him, then you should be advocating for the fight. In other news, it appears that former WBA cruiserweight champion Denis Lebedev has decided, after 18 years, to call it a career. And I can't say that I didn't see this coming, because I actually did. Guy's pushing 40, he's been around the block, he's been there and done that. And given that the biggest name at the weight, Alexander Usyk, has officially moved up to the heavyweight division, he's relinquished all the belts that he was holding. When the biggest name at the weight moves up, that doesn't leave behind very much for an old-timer like Denis Lebedev to shoot for. That doesn't leave behind very much for him to do. There were rumblings of a WBA-mandated title fight between Denis Lebedev and Lawrence Okolie, but that never materialized. And then there were more rumblings of a mandated title fight between Denis Lebedev and the WBA's regular champion,
Le Francis,
Arsène Goulamarian, undefeated guy, regular champion via the WBA. The prospect of having to fight a guy like that for Denis Lebedev, who's 40 years old, a fight that doesn't yield much of a financial incentive, it's not a big situation, it's your run-of-the-mill kind of situation. The prospect of Denis finding himself in such a situation, it just wasn't appealing enough for him to have stuck around. And in all honesty, I don't blame him. You know that Denis Lebedev has been in there with anyone from, Marco Huck to a Roy Jones Jr. to a James Toney. Faded versions of the latter, but better still, he's been in there with the likes of a James Toney, a Roy Jones Jr., a Enzo Maccarinelli, a Murat Gassiev, a Latif Coyote. Essentially, this is a guy who's been around the block. I mean, he really has. And all things considered, when you look at his professional record,
it's not bad.
32 wins with only 2 professional losses, 23 knockouts, coming off 3 consecutive victories. I'd have to say that, Denis Lebedev, he did it the right way. He retired on his own terms. He looked at what was going on and he decided, I've had enough. He didn't let the game retire him. Rather, he retired from the game. I don't think he had much to prove at this point anyway. An old-timer hanging around a young man's sport like this,
wearing out his welcome.
It's a disaster that's just waiting to happen. So I think he made the right call. And now, Arsène Goulamarian will have a target on his back. Once the World Boxing Super Series is over, that will leave only one world title for the winner of the World Boxing Super Series to collect. You understand? Arsen Goulamirian has been elevated to full champion status in the cruiserweight division. He now has the full version of the WBA title. Whereas the winner of the World Boxing Super Series, whoever that might be, whether it's Junior Dorticos or Mavis Bradis, whoever comes out on top in that fight, they're going to be in possession of the other three belts. The IBF, the WBC, and the WBO. And I've no doubts that whoever the winner is, they are going to set their sights almost immediately on Arsen Goulamirian, who, while he is undefeated, when you take a look at his CV, you look at this guy's resume to see what the hell's he been doing and who's he been doing it with, well, his quality of competition is largely pedestrian. That's not said to be critical of the guy. The World Boxing Super Series has been held in the cruiserweight division for at least 2 seasons now, so that might explain why there's a lack of big names on this guy's resume. All the big names have been wrapped up in the World Boxing Super Series for at least 2 years now. Dmitry Kudryashov, Murat Gassiev, Mavis Bradis, Alexander Usyk, Krzysztof Glowacki. All these different guys that are some of the who's who guys in the division. Well, these guys have been all wrapped up in the Super Series for at least 2 seasons now. So maybe that would explain why Arsen's quality of competition seems largely pedestrian. But all of that is about to change very soon, because once a winner is determined and he is crowned with those 3 world titles and the Muhammad Ali trophy and the Ring Magazine belt, I've no doubts that the next scalp they're going to try to collect is Arsen's. Not quite sure that he's ready for that. The current state of the cruiserweight division and how the cookie may crumble there, it's an environment to where whosoever becomes the undisputed champion at the weight at this point in the juncture is someone who may end up having a very, very long reign there, because most of the top-notch, top-tier, top-quality competition has already been taken care of. They've already been taken out. Most of them have already participated in the tournament. Thus, whoever emerges, they have a unique opportunity for a career and legacy-defining reign as what could be an undisputed champion, not even just a unified champion, but an undisputed champion. What we've been seeing from a lot of fighters that become undisputed champions is that they're only undisputed for a second. They don't rack up, Usyk, for example, he only had 1 title defense as an undisputed champion. Terence Crawford, shortly after becoming undisputed, he moved right up to the welterweight division, so he didn't even get the chance to rack up any title defenses, and that's not said to be a slight against the fighters. It's just that in this situation, it is going to be a bit different. Whoever can become undisputed at cruiserweight right now, they have a unique opportunity of not just becoming undisputed, but having a very long reign as an undisputed champion. So, we'll see what develops at the weight, but for now, I guess, congratulations to Arsen for being elevated to full champion status, however anticlimactic that may be. Well, that's the way the cookie crumbled, and we'll see what develops. And finally, Unified Heavyweight Champion Andy Ruiz is saying that he will refuse to rematch Anthony Joshua if the rematch is set to take place in the UK. The Unified Champion is asserting himself as the A-side in negotiations, assuming there even are any, because, well, this rematch situation is predisposed. It's all predetermined based on a contract that Andy Ruiz already signed. I'm not even sure he has any say in the matter. But better still, he is asserting himself as the A-side. He is saying that he would like the rematch to take place in either Mexico or
New York City,
Madison Square Garden back in New York, where the first fight took place. And he's outright saying that if they try to stage it in the UK, he will outright refuse to do so. That if Anthony Joshua tries to stage it there, doesn't matter, he is the A-side. These are just my thoughts. There's been a lot of talk about this in the Facebook boxing groups and the YouTube channels as to whether or not Andy Ruiz actually has it within his power to refuse to fight in the UK. And I think that this is actually getting more attention than it deserves, because the ink is already dried on the contracts, boys and girls. That's the reality of the shit. He already signed a legally binding document, and because of that document, he is bound to give Anthony Joshua a rematch, and if he so refuses, he will incur hefty penalties. That is without question. I mean, that's why these contracts are drawn up in the first place. So if somebody tries to renege, don't think you're gonna renege and not pay for it. So let's just say that the day comes where the venue and the date is decided, and what is decided upon is a fight in the UK. If Andy Ruiz so chooses to not go forward with the rematch, he will likely be sued for more than what he earned in the first fight. And I have no doubts that the prospect of being sued for that much money will leave Andy Ruiz so inclined to get that passport out and board that plane. Contracts are already signed, ladies and germs. There's not much that can be done about it now because they have planned ahead of time for just such an event. It's the reality of it. Do I blame Andy Ruiz for asserting himself? No, of course not. He did pay the cost to be the boss. You know, where a lot of other guys stepped down, he's the one who stepped up. He earned the right to feel himself and talk his shit and try to have things his way. But until he handles this rematch situation, he's not in the clear yet. So if they so choose to stage it in the UK, that might be something that he just has to deal with. It might be a tough pill to swallow, but, you know, that's the contract, folks. What are you going to do? They're looking at two possible places for this thing. Now, one is where the first fight took place, in New York City at Madison Square Garden at a date in November. The other, however, is at the Principality Stadium in Cardiff, that's the UK, at a date in December. We don't know right now, right here and now, which one of the two they're going to decide to go with. As far as we know, Anthony Joshua wants to stage the second fight in the same place they staged the first fight. He wants to right the wrong where it took place. I think that's ballsy. I think that's the way to go, and I think that's the best way to make a statement. But better still, if they change their minds, they have the power to do so. You know, they entrusted themselves with those powers upon offering Andy Ruiz the fight. And the moment that he signed on the dotted line, he made himself subject to those powers. It really is that simple. I know there's a lot of guys out there, they got this schoolyard mentality when they think about this situation. But rest assured, kids, the contract ain't written in crayon. If you can't understand that fucking shit, it's likely because you still play with sock puppets in front of a flashlight. This ain't kid stuff, okay? This is more or less the reason why Dillian Whyte's negotiations for a rematch with Anthony Joshua fell apart. Because Dillian Whyte saw what was incorporated into the contract in the event that he won, and he didn't like what he saw. But he didn't have the power to change it, so he decided to walk. Whereas in the case of Andy, you already know he signed on the dotted line, so you already know what's going on. So, as much as Andy and perhaps some of you out there that are listening to this video might think that Andy Ruiz is in the power position to call the shots, the reality of it is he might not even have any say-so in the matter.